No, hello.
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 Hello. Yeah, we'll give people a couple minutes to join and then we can get started.
Ay,
I think we can go and get started. So welcome to the Velero community meeting, April 16th, 2024. We'll go ahead and jump into the status updates for myself. A couple weeks ago, I submitted a design PR for multi-threaded backup item processing. There have been a few review comments. I've gone up, responded to those comments, starting the process of thinking through the next round of updates this week. One thing I realized after the discussions last week, I need more details around the need for the compatibility mode to fall back if their V2 plugins are present, kind of specifically kind of highlight the risk in terms of possible data integrity issues if we don't do that. I'm going to add some detail. There's some comments already about that, but I want to get that into the main text of the design. I want to add a section near the end around kind of exactly what you need to do to upgrade a V1 or V2 plugin to V3, because in most cases it's going to be fairly specific. Add these functions that don't necessarily need to have any implementation. There's the new API function and how to manage that. So I'm going to add some documentation around that, and also kind of talk a bit about the timeline for when that would be needed. Because of the phased approach, adding the API changes and the kind of workflow changes before we add any any concurrent changes, there will really be no kind of end user visible changes. So you'll have that kind of extra release cycle to work through that. And the other thing, actually, something Raghu brought up is the design that's in the document now really doesn't take into account the ordered resources property at all. That's actually a problem, needs to be addressed. Basically, there's a field ordered resources on backup, and that's a list of items, basically type and name, that need to be backed up first. So because that's a strict ordering, we really need to make sure those are not done in parallel with each other. So I need to update the design to make sure that basically we're going to handle the ordered resources for, they're already first because the item collector already sorts them properly. But what we need to do is identify those as ordered resources and then process those just using a single request at a time once we get to the phase 2 with the multi-threading, so that we don't have the risk of, say starting 5 different ordered resources concurrently, and then the 5th one might get finished before the first. So we want to avoid that. So I'm planning on updating the design to take that into account. I've already added some comments, kind of back and forth with Raghu, kind of with some thinking about how I'm going to modify that. But expect by the end of the week to have that actually in the document itself. So then we can add that to the review. So that's it from my status. Does anybody else on the call have status updates?
Hey, Scott, I just have one
Yes.
question about the
Yes, sir.
ordered resources, right?
Yep.
So the semantics, does the ordered resource say that they have to be backed up first, or they only can't be backed up out of order?
So I'm trying to remember what the documentation mentions. I know the implementation puts them first. Basically, if you look at the item collector, because I was looking at that last night after I saw your comment, kind of refreshing my memory on how that's handled. And basically, once the item collector gets the full list of all the items in the backup, we then go. There's a sort method that's called that finds the ordered resources. So basically, it takes the ordered resources from backup, and for those resources that are in the item list, it brings them to the front. So what the backup logic gets right now from the item collector is a list of all the resources identified for the backup, ordered resources first in order, and then after that, it's the resources as identified. Then there's some kind of hard-coded type level sorting where we do pods, then PVCs, then PVs to make sure that hooks work properly. And then after that, it's whatever order they were in there, kind of by but by group resource.
Oh, okay.
So in other words,
yeah.
the implementation certainly has them first. I'd have to go back and look at the documentation to see if that's guaranteed. But I see your point. If the API does not guarantee that those are first, we could implement those by simply, back to my original idea, just create a single item block for all of those, and then the other stuff can go in parallel. I suspect users are. There's the API, which is say, well, what we document is expected behavior, but then there's what the reality of what users have been used to, and I think ordered resources is one way users possibly are saying, hey, I want this backed up first. So I think it would be a mistake to change the expectations around that, even if it's not documented. Because right now, when you set ordered resources, those get backed up first.
Oh, okay.
Probably safer to stick with that.
I haven't seen in the documentation itself, like you explained, but maybe it's time to probably update the documentation.
Oh, we should certainly update the documentation to make it clear. But I also think unless we have a good reason to do so, it might be better to stick with the expectation that ordered resources are also backed up first, because I think that's one of the ways that people have used them, is to say, hey, I want to make sure this thing happens first, put it there. And again, that already may be in the documentation. We already may be saying those are going to be first. I'm not sure. I just know that the actual workflow does back those up first. I'd be wary of changing that since it's been that way, since longer than I've been on the project.
Sure. No, that makes sense. I mean, I only checked the API type, like the backup API type, right? The comment about the field.
Yeah,
that
exactly.
doesn't mention anything about being first, but that's okay. I mean, you're right. I mean, it's better to be conservative and follow that. And the second question I have again about ordered resources is it's per resource type and then the resources within the type, right? So is the order maintained between the types as well?
So ordered resources, I believe, and again, I have to go back and look at this to see if this. Ordered resources are specific items. So in other words, an ordered resource is not a type; it's a name. So you'd say I want PVC1 and then PVC4 and then PVC3 in that order. I believe that's the way ordered resources is set up. It's not by item and then by. It's not.
I think that's the spec. At least the spec seems to be by. It's like a map with type for, and the value is the list of names.
Yeah, I'll need to look at that. Yeah, I guess before I go to update the design, I'm going to have to go and be clear on exactly, again, what that specifies. But I know the item collector puts those first, and once they're first, then we go through those in order as they're there. So regardless of how it's defined and parsed, which again, I need to make sure I understand before I obviously do anything with this, sounds to me like the appropriate way of handling this is basically to handle the item block processing as we are already, but then to make sure that when we're handling item blocks for ordered resources, those get processed one at a time, not in parallel. once we've completed the last ordered resource, then we can start to open it up to, whatever our number we can do in parallel.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, makes sense.
So that's that. And again, that's just a complete oversight. It's great you've brought that up because that definitely needs to be in the design. Once I get that updated, I'll ping you in the PR thread so we can kind of go on from there in case there's anything.
Sorry, Scott. We are still reviewing the PR. Sorry, I'm late due to the networking issue. But around the PR, yeah, the review is still in progress from our side.
Sure.
But we have some concern regarding the ROI perspective, because this makes the model of the plugin a little tricky. But adding the multi-thread, the concern is that they really improve the performance a lot, because in the backup process, the item collector has already fetch the objects and resources into the cache. So when you add multi-thread, you only read from the local cache in a multi-threaded way. So the concern is how much does it really improve the performance? Is there any tests to prove this?
It would be good to add. I didn't know we ran into one situation where a backup had a large number of pods and with PVCs, and the issue they ran into is that even though the bulk of the work, we've now moved that into asynchronous, which improves the situation obviously, but there's still that initial synchronous portion at the beginning before we have the item, the snap handle. I think that may not be the exact. I may be a little wrong on exactly what we're waiting for, but I know there's a synchronous portion with the CSI. And the situation they ran into was the backup was taking more than 24 hours and most of that was waiting one at a time, going through the synchronous portion of the CSI plugin. So that's one example that I know of that this would definitely make a difference for. More generally, I don't know that it might be good to have some benchmarking.
I can think of Scott.
But
I can think of another one, right? It's not just the CSI, but the one that I mentioned in the GitHub, if you're talking about KubeVirt backup, right, where the virtual machines, VM snapshots have to be taken, and that will happen in the plugin, right? KubeVirt plugin. So those
that's through this. You mean the CSI snapshot of the volume, the backing volume?
I mean, there is a concept of VM snapshot itself, right? So which will take some time, I guess. And that will be parallelized with this approach, isn't it?
Yeah, those would be as like because each VM is through a separate pod, so those would be parallelized with this approach. That's true. There might be some way of taking that part and making it asynchronous as well. I don't know. That would be a different question. The KubeVirt plugin itself might be able to make use of asynchronous. That would also resolve some of this.
Right.
But I do say I do need to mention though that the parallelization is only one of the reasons we need the plugin API change. The other reason is that it's absolutely needed to handle something equivalent to this. Maybe it's not this exact change, but we need something to handle grouping items beyond what we're able to group now, so that we can handle volume group snapshots, which is a kind of future feature that I know it's on the roadmap that we have an issue for. Basically, we need to be able to the item block gets those, and then we can, and the moving of the hooks to go before and after the block again is a prerequisite for managing those.
Yeah, I think the sorry, because we were still busy with the FC work, so we haven't think it through very carefully. But generally, I think the item block may be a good idea, but I really have some concern regarding introduce the plugin v3, because if you think about the volume group snapshot, it doesn't really need parallelism, right? Because user add.
No, you're right. You're right. The parallelism is not at all needed for volume group snapshot. However, the item block concept is needed for the volume group snapshots,
hook, right?
And the the plugin changes are to support the item block concept, not to support the necessarily. I mean, in other words, we need the plugin change to identify item blocks. Once we have item blocks identified, that's when you can parallelize things.
Yeah, but do we really need a very generic way to identify the item block? We need to introduce another version of BIA. That's something I'm not very sure. Because if you think about the scenario of volume group snapshot, that's a very specific issue. We can use the selector to group volumes into the volume groups snapshot, right?
Yeah.
And
well, yeah,
we can
you
use
also have
that
to get the
mechanism
pods.
to group
So
pods into a
yeah,
item
if
block.
you didn't do plugin changes, you would have to instead kind of hard code all this into the
Yes.
API, and then
Yes.
you know, basically treat pod groups as kind of a separate
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
That's and I guess
Yeah.
part of the thinking here was the item block kind of concept worked because it supported two different things. It supported the parallelism, and at the same time, we also got what we needed for item blocks for volume groups. And the parallelism itself then facilitates then building on top of that same infrastructure to do then two backups at once, because then you can use those same workers that handle one block at a time, and now you can, you know, maybe worker one's doing a block for backup one and worker two is doing a block for backup two, and so that's a kind of easy way to configure. I want 10 threads total, and then if I'm doing two backups at once, I'm still using the same 10 threads. So the advantage here was the same concept to the item block was able to build and kind of create multiple features.
Yeah, I understand.
And if we did
yeah.
kind of one-off for say volume group snapshots, then we have nothing that helps us in those other areas. And we have the more complicated workflow logic, because now we're having to have all these if blocks. If this is a pod, then we'll do this. And if it's a, you know, the plugin approach kind of simplifies that and lets us treat all resources kind of in the same way in the core workflow logic.
But yeah, but we kind of, but yeah, I understand the idea, but I'm really not very convinced to combine these two questions into one.
And I guess another way of looking at it from my point of view is, if we decided we were going to never parallelize backups and never do two backups at once, then we could say, okay, we can design something a little bit simpler for
I think
the volume group snapshots.
Yeah.
But at the same
but
time,
I think, yeah.
if we do that and then later go on to do the parallelism, now we end up with something much more complicated than if we started with this design. It works for both, and so the end result is a lot simpler. So, you know, if we know now, if we decide now, hey, we're never going to do backups in parallel, we're never going to do items in parallel, then volume group snapshots would be a slightly simpler thing, because we wouldn't need the plugin API.
I think the one concern is that introducing the parallelism within one backup, how much does it really improve? I mean, how much improvement does it really make to the performance? Given we, you know, when doing the backup, we read the resources from the cache, and we have already the asynchronous mechanism plugins to, you know, improve the situation for snapshots.
Yeah, and what we've seen, it sounds like in some cases is that if you have a smaller number of large volumes, the vast majority of work is asynchronous, and so this is not going to solve as much for you. If you have a large number of small volumes, the synchronous component becomes a lot more significant for those volumes, and that's where again we ran into a situation where someone was saying their backup was taking, you know, I think 40 hours because they had thousands of very small volumes.
Yeah, but maybe we can solve the very specific problem in a specific way, rather than introducing a very generic mechanism like plugin v3, which, you know, where I really don't like very much the situation that if a plugin does not satisfy the V3 spec, then it will impact other plugin. I think that design is a little problematic.
Yeah, that's only a temporary bootstrapping thing though too, because again, if we're going to implement the baseline, phase 1 and say 1.15, and then we're not going to actually go have volume group snapshots or parallelism until 1.16, that gives plugin authors a full release cycle to update. And part of the documentation here is a very simple, migration guide to say, here's what you need to do to your plugin to make it V3. So that'll give them several months and clear documentation on what to do. One of the things I'm also hoping to do is this week when I do the updates to the PR is just to, again, to provide a bit more concrete example, is I was going to take a couple of the OpenShift plugins that we have and create a draft PR using V3. Obviously, it won't compile because V3 doesn't exist yet, but just kind of showing if I make these code changes, this plugin is now V3, to kind of give a concrete idea of how much work it is. I think that might be helpful to illustrate and have the discussion, because then we can be talking about what's needed and how much it is, and that might help to have that discussion around the amount of work to do this versus that, rather than right now talking in the abstract of V2 versus V3, when it's really hard to say what does that mean in terms of real world work. How easy is this, how difficult is this? I think that's going to help to the discussion if I get that in place this week.
Yeah, again, I feel there can be some disagreement here because generally for a plugin V3, you want to introduce a very generic way for us to group the resources to help parallelism, right? But the other approach, if you want to do the parallelism, maybe we can group resources in a very opinionated way. And like we only group the pods so that we can back up different pods in parallelism to improve the performance when there are many volumes, rather than we will introduce a very generic plugin, which if any other plugin does not satisfy the spec, then it will fall back to a different mode. I think
you definitely have a trade-off there, because again, that might make this simpler case easier, but what you lose if you take that approach is any custom plugins that also involve resource intensive activity. That doesn't help you there. Or if you have resource requirements, for example, what if my pod has secrets associated with it and my hook modifies those secrets in some way, and I want those backed up that's hypothetical, I know, but I'm just saying that in general, when you have plugins and pluggability, that's kind of the approach Velero takes in most of the time with this stuff. That gives users the ability to, or not so much users, but developers that are packaging this and working in the ability to kind of make use of those generic features to manage their custom requirements. If we build this in a very specific way just for pods and PVCs, that'll handle probably 95% of the problems, but it might prevent fixing the situation in those kind of more custom situations involving end user plugins. So and I guess if we're talking plugins, that's the downside that you're mentioning is V3. That requires plugin writers to do some additional work to update the plugins. So I think the trade-off there is one approach requires every plugin writer to do something relatively easy. If we make it change so they don't have to do that relatively easy thing, we're now preventing plugin writers from doing the complicated thing of actually making these associations to handle very specific, complex custom needs. So that's the trade-off, I think.
Yeah, but to be honest, I'm not very convinced here. Yeah, you can update the PR, but still, I think there are a lot more discussion need to happen before we make decision. If that's okay to you, I think
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
we
you can
definitely,
go ahead. Yeah.
as I said, you know, there are some things that need to be added here before we can make a decision anyway, because I've identified a few things that are specifically lacking here, and I think the examples might help to have that discussion around, you know, the pros and cons kind of those approaches.
Okay. Yeah, then yeah, please go ahead. Make change if you like, but yeah, here we really do have some concern about the overall approach. So yeah, I think we can continue discussing this, but I don't think we can convince each other here in this meeting.
Okay, any other status updates before we move on to discussion?
Yeah, we are very close to FC, and we will be checking day by day if there are any issue and PR emerged. So if there are any PR you think you need to merge before FC, please let us know, and I will label them accordingly. Otherwise, when all the PR are merged, all the PRs that we think targeting FC are merged, we'll reach the milestone of FC, and other PRs making change to the feature will be, you know, a very strict review before it can be merged, and it will probably be kicked out to the next minor release. Just a reminder.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, I think we can move on to discussion topics. Matthias had one. Let me bring up the issue here. So
I'm trying to work on that issue, but looking what is written there is confusion to me. For example, I thought I just need to remove package generated, like this the only missing to do. But after some investigation, I think there's more need to do, like removing packet plugin generated as well. So if someone can update the issue describing what's missing to this issue to be completed would be good for me. And also Scott said that this issue is good to only be resolved on 115 cycle. So if that information can also be
package generate package generated removal was we decided in the early in the 113 cycle not to do that because it's possible that someone else was relying on that code, even, you know, maybe not likely, but since the code's there, it's part of the API, it's possible. So that was deprecated in 1.13, I believe. So I believe that means we should look to, you know, at the earliest remove it in 1.15. Now, considering that we're almost feature complete for 1.14 anyway, that's probably not controversial today anyway, because I think even if we could remove it now, we'd say, hey, this wasn't already in the milestone. We're going to push this off to 115 anyway. So I think it's safe to say this makes sense to me as a 115 issue. I don't know if there's anyone else that has a thought on that. As to the specifics of other than package generated, I'm not, let's see, I guess if the people that worked on this before could look at this and update it, in case there's anything else that you might be missing, you might want to bring this up on Slack as well, just because not everybody's on this particular call today. But I think that makes sense to have that discussion to figure out what else is needed so we can get this, you know, kind of run through in 115.
All right. Well, also
so here, let me clarify. So you have a PR to fix this, and you're not sure what's blocking this PR from being merged. Is that the question?
More or less. So blocking would be when it can be merged, but also what I have to do. For example, looking this on the V113, the only to-do list remaining is the pack generate. That's the only thing I did on my PR, just removed that. But after reviewing, I think your PR about updating Go language 1.22, I saw that we also need to remove packet plugin generated, right? So that, for example, for me is not clear on this issue.
Okay. So I would suggest you ping Xun directly on Slack, because he won't be able to join the meeting in the US time zone, or you can join the community meeting in Beijing time zone to discuss it.
All right.
This one was not on my radar. Yeah. So you're okay that that PR, is moved to the 1.15, right?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, and were there any other issues or status updates that anyone wanted to discuss? I guess we can probably wrap this up then. Next week, regular time, Beijing time zone, and I expect we'll probably have some follow-on discussions around the multi-threaded stuff, and then release issues as well. So we will talk next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.